So today is lesson 12, and we are having a quick look. I put the link in our chat. A number of you are members already, but I will just mention again, we do have a computer studies LinkedIn group, which you may want to join. We post Morning Matthew, relevant info, jobs, content, and this is for both current students in any of the computer studies programs as well as graduates. Also a place to network with people who have maybe been through the program in the past. So feel free to just send a request to join if you're interested, or search for Computer Studies Georgian College, and I can admit you to the group. Morning, Brugar. Welcome. Okay, so today, what are we doing? We're basically going to resume our single page application. Last week, we set it up so that we could create and read data. We also want to implement the update and delete functionality. I know you worked hard. People spent a lot of time on assignment 3. I haven't got all of them, so if your assignment 3 is still outstanding, it's now late. But please make sure you submit it to get the most marks you possibly can. I don't want to give out a 0, but if I have nothing to mark, I don't really have any choice. Okay, so please submit assignment 3 today if you have not. I think I've gotten about 25 of 35, which is not a terrible ratio, but it's not great. So please make sure that you submit that assignment today. So we probably won't require a full 3 hours for today's class, just give you a picture of where we're going. So here was my sample project. Oh, hang on, let me just make sure I get it running again. So I'll start my backend server. Oh, whoops, sorry. This is the one we did in class. Hope if I serve the right application, I got 2 projects open. You can go ahead and open up. Okay, so here's our app. This is where we're going. So I want to be able to turn the artist names into links. So when I click on one, it will fill into my form. I could then save changes and have my form clear out. Or I could also delete the artist. And again, our data stays up to date without any kind of full page or refresh. So this is the functionality that we want to capture. 3 things: select an artist, delete an artist, update an artist, clear out our form all on our single page. So this is what we want to accomplish today. So I want you to open up both the projects we did last week. So here's my Angular client application that will run on localhost 4200. I'm also going to open up my NodeTunes single page server application in a new window. So I need to start both servers. So in my server app, I'm going to use NodeMon. And to test that our server, our API is running, if we hit the endpoint, orange alien, if we hit the endpoint API artists, we should get all our artists in JSON format showing up in our browser. I'll then want to go to my client application, which we called the NodeTune single page application client. And I'll use ng-serve to start that up. So now we've got two apps running, our server application running on port 3000, our Angular client application running on port 4200. Okay, so this is kind of where we left our application off the end of class last week. We could view the list of artists. We also have the ability to save a new artist. And as soon as we hit save, our form gets cleared out. And our new artist shows up over here. So this is where we left off last week. All the code is up on GitHub. If you missed something, again, if you're using my Git repository, you will just want to make sure that you're changing the database connection string in the globals file. So we kind of have three steps we need to implement today. The first step is we want to be able to select an artist. So we want these artist names to be links. And when we click one, we're going to populate our details form with the artist name. Once we can select and display a particular artist, we can then implement the delete and the update features. So let's start with the selecting of an artist. So we'll go to our client app. So we're going to need to make changes in a few files. We're going to make changes to our service. Actually, I'm not sure if we need to make change to our service, or I think we just need a method here. We'll need a select artist method in our component. So we wrote a bunch of methods here last week. We had get artists that runs on ng init. So that's what populates our list here on the left. We wrote the add artist method that gets called to create a new artist when the user submits the form. And we had a clear form method that just wipes out our artist name. So in this case, we're going to call select artist. Then it'll take two parameters. Actually, I guess we can go this way. Our first parameter will be the ID, which is a string. And then the name, which will also be a string. So what we want to do is fill. We've got a name property right now. We want to fill both the name and the ID from the artist that is selected. So we're also going to add up here an ID property. Again, can be string or undefined. So when we're going to need this ID, we haven't needed it up until now, but we're going to need it when we are deleting or editing. So we know which artist document are we working with. So we'll declare that parameter. And now we can just populate so we will populate input form with selected artist properties. So now we're going to turn those artist names in our list, we're going to turn them into links. And each one, when we click it, it's going to call the select artist method we've got here. Okay, so we've added the underscore ID property as a string. And now we've got a new method that will populate our form whenever the user clicks on an artist. So now we'll go back to our HTML file. And we're going to change this artist name a little bit. We're going to turn it into an anchor tag. We'll give it a class. We'll make this H5 the class definition instead. So it will be styled. And it will be a dead link. It's not going to go to another page. So we'll just add an href equals $. And then we can add a click handler here. So click. So we're going to select the artist, and then we're going to pass in the ID and the name. So now we can see if this is going to work. Go back to our browser. These become links. And now as soon as we click on one, we're populating the name and ID property. And because our ng model in our form, here in our form, this input, it's bound with this ng model directive, it's bound to the artist name attribute. So anytime we click an artist, our form populates. I'm going to make a little CSS change. I want to get rid of the underlining on these links. So I will go to our project style sheet, our styles.css, and under the anchor, I'll set the text decoration to none. So this should get rid of that underlining. Again, this is in our styles.css, which is down in the root of it's inside the SRC, the source folder. Okay, so now I don't get that underline. Now we have one more slight thing to do to finish off the artist selection. It does populate the artist name here, but we're not actually doing anything with the ID. If we go and look at our details form, we've got an input here for name. We are going to need to use this ID though, because we're going to need it when we're processing a delete or an update. So what I'll do is just add this into a hidden input. Actually, maybe for now, I'll say type equals text. We'll change the type from text to hidden in a minute. Just want to make sure that it gets populated. ID equals underscore ID, name equals underscore ID, and our ng model. So this text input, it's bound to the ID property in the same way that the first text input is bound to the name property. So now when we click, we can see the artist ID that gets generated by MongoDB. It shows up automatically here. Now we don't want to show this. It shouldn't be a text box. It should be a hidden input. I wanted to make it text just for starters, so we could actually make sure it had the right values, which it does. Okay, so we can change the type to hidden. So it's in the form, but we don't actually, user doesn't see the values. They don't need to see the values. And make sure your hidden input, it's got to go before your form closes. So it can't go, if it goes after that form tag, it's going to get ignored. Now we'll also want to make reference to this field in our clear form. So when our form clears out, we want to set this .id back to undefined. So I'll go back to the component and inside of clear form. Not only is the name going to be wiped out, but we want to wipe out the selected ID as well when the form is cleared. So now we can start to write. Now that we can select an artist, actually, before we do delete, we should also add maybe a clear or reset button here. So, I've selected an artist, but if I want to add a new one right now, I don't have any easy way to do this other than to refresh the page. We've already got a clear form method, so why don't we add a button on that will automatically clear the values. So go back to our HTML, and let's add on another button. Just give it a little margin of 1 so the two buttons aren't pushed right against each other. And when this button is clicked, we'll call our clear form method of our Angular component. And our button text can just say clear. So I missed an S here. So it's like a reset button. When we selected an artist, it populates the name and ID. If we don't want to do anything, we can then just undo that selection. So when I clear, it gets wiped out. And by adding that M1 class, it gives me that little margin on the left. So the two buttons are not touching. A little bit of space, a little bit of white space. So now that we can select an artist, our next task is to be able to delete an artist. So we really need 3 delete artist methods. Anybody have any idea why do we need 3 methods and where are they going to go? Why don't we just need 1 delete method? Why would we need 3? So let's think about the architecture. Okay, Adam, I wasn't actually thinking about delete album. We may have to come back to that, but just for the artist. But good thinking. Think about the different layers of our application. Just pull it back up on Blackboard for just a minute. So think about our structure. We've got our database and our model. And in our server, we've got the Node and Express controller. And then in the client, we've got our Angular service and our Angular component. So we're going to need a delete method here in our API. We're going to need a delete method in our Angular service that calls this, and we need a delete method in the Angular component. So the component calls the service, and the service calls the server API. And then in our view, we'll have a delete button that will invoke the component, which will invoke the service, which will invoke the controller. Okay, so it's a chain of events. So yes, Chris, you're right. We're going to select the artist, we're going to delete the artist and refresh the list, but we're actually going to need a delete method in each of these 3 layers. And one calls the other one. So let's start in the back end. Let's start in our server API. So let's go to our controller, our artist controller. So right now we've got 2 methods. We've got a get and a post. So our URL is going to be the same. It's going to be /API/artist, but our method this time is going to be delete. So we're going to try to delete the selected artist and return either 400 or 204, which is resource modified. So we're going to use our express router, and this time we're going to call the delete method. So the path comes in, and we're going to have a parameter here of _ID with our callback. So we're going to call artist.remove. Our ID is equal to our request.params._ID. So this serves as like our where clause. It will identify which specific artist document we want to get rid of. And then we will either get back an error if there's an error, we'll do our usual response. We'll log it and send back the error as JSON with a bad request status. So maybe, for example, we've called this URL, but without an ID parameter. So that should generate a bad request. Otherwise, we'll just send back the JSON response of 204. Sorry, I'm dog sitting this week. I'm going to get the barking dogs in the house. Come on, guys, come. Okay, so there's our server delete method. Now we could actually try this method on its own. So here's one way to do that. Actually, you know what? No, we'll leave it we'll have to install another tool for that. I guess we could try it. We got time. Sorry, a little indecisive. Okay, let's use a tool. This is a useful tool. Some of you have it already. Do you have Postman on your machine? You may have used this tool in your ASP.NET class. Do you have Postman, or is this new? It's free software. Okay. Yeah, you could use, I'm not familiar with Insomnia. It's probably the same thing. Postman's really common. So if you want to go ahead and grab it, so it's a platform for building and using APIs. So it's a way for us to test an API, right? Where there's no front end application. We just want to make API calls. So I'm going to open it up. Maybe give me a thumbs up when you have it. If you have another tool for testing APIs, that's fine. You don't have to use Postman. Chrissy said it was Insomnia. Never heard of that one. If you have that, maybe it's the same thing. Okay, yeah, an API client. Yeah, if you have Insomnia, that's fine. You can use it. You don't need Postman. They basically, looks like they pretty much do the same things. So if you have Insomnia already, by all means, you can use it. If you want to try out Postman, that's fine too. So Postman allows us to make API requests. We can choose our method, and then we can pick a URL. It can be local or it can be an API that's online. And we can make different types of API requests to test this out. So if I just want to try out my API kind of divorced from the Angular application. So I can make a request in here to our artist API at localhost 3000. I can make a GET request. And it returns, here's our JSON object, same object we sort of see in the browser already. But this is also going to allow me to now test out the delete method. So if I go and take one of the ID values, so here's the band, the 1975. If I add that ID on to the end of my URL with a slash, and I can try out my delete. So I'll submit my delete request, and it tells me, okay, I got a 200 OK response with one object deleted. Now, did it actually get deleted? Well, if I make a GET request now and look at my data, then I can see that the 1975, it's gone. So my delete worked. If I try a delete and put in an invalid ID, like ABC123, okay, so it didn't give me an error, but it just said, Okay, so my value is invalid here. So it didn't get an error, but it didn't delete anything, which is good. Shouldn't delete anything in that case. Okay, so our delete method appears to work in our API. So now we need to add the delete method to our Angular service, to our Angular component, and then we need a delete button in our form that will invoke that chain of delete methods. Okay. If you need me to keep this delete method up for a minute, let me know. Otherwise, we'll jump back over to our Angular application and we'll look at our Angular service. So I'm going to go to my artist service. We've got two methods here, a get and a post. We'll now set up our delete. Takes a string parameter. I probably should define these other, oh no, actually, sorry, we don't need to do that in the service. So now we're going to return this .http. We're calling the delete method this time. And now we're going to append on our ID variable. So the URL is still API/artist, but now we've got a parameter at the end. And again, we have to pass in our HTTP headers, same like we did for the post, which appends that the content type is JSON. So this is the service. This is the method that will invoke our server API. So this was our second of 3 delete methods. First one in the server API, second one in the Angular service. So the Angular service, it's the bridge between your Angular front end and our Node and Express API backend. So then we'll need to jump over to our component next to write our third of 3 methods. And that method will invoke this one. And then we'll need to modify our HTML because right now there is no way to invoke a delete. I can pick an artist, but I have no way to actually trigger this. So we'll go to the artist component. We'll set up a delete artist here that again takes string parameter. We also want to add a little confirmation here. Now, because this is, even though our file is TypeScript, we can actually write regular JavaScript in here as well. So we can say if confirm. So we can use the JavaScript confirm method. So if that returns true, then we can say this dot service dot delete artist. We'll pass in the ID and then we're going to subscribe. We're going to wait for the response. So we'll get some kind of response. With our asynchronous, our callback. So once this completes, what should we do? after we delete an artist. I think there's two things we should do. So after this runs, it's going to remove it from the database. What should happen in the front end of our application once an artist document gets removed? Yeah, that's right. We can actually, instead of refreshing the whole page, we can just refresh the list and clear the form. So we can call our get method and then our clear method. Pretty much the same things that we're doing after we add. Right? Refresh the list, clear out the form. The page itself doesn't have to refresh. The overall HTML document will be static in our browser window. Oops, and I should spell it correctly. So we've written, you can see now our three methods. One in the server, one in the Angular service, and one in the Angular component. So the service is that bridge, because the component and the API, they don't talk directly to each other. They can, but that structure is not recommended. It's more code this way, but it's more modular, more scalable, more reusable. So the last thing we need to do is go to our artist component.html. We need to add a delete button with an event handler, so when that button is clicked, it starts the chain of delete methods. So I'll go to the component. Maybe after my artist button, we can add a delete button here. So in this case, I'll use btn danger. We'll make the button red. Also give it a margin of 1. And it's got a click handler. And our editor recognizes the delete artist. And we can just pass in our ID parameter. So this line 24, this gives the user something to click, and it invokes the method in our component, passing in the selected ID parameter. So this should all happen pretty much instantly. We select an artist, our form will populate. We click delete, we're going to get a little JavaScript confirmation window. If we click OK, nothing happens. If we click cancel to that JavaScript pop-up, our artist should get removed from the database, and our artist list should automatically refresh. So we can give it a try now. Okay. That's because not assignable to parameter of type string. Okay. Let's figure that out. Why is it telling us this? So in our component, is not assignable. Okay. When our form loads, the ID is null. So we don't want this delete artist button here unless we have an ID, right? When the ID is undefined, this throws an error. So we also want to add to our button another little Angular directive. So at the end of our button, we're going to use *ng if so the delete artist button is only visible when there is an ID. When the page first loads, there is no, that ID value is undefined because the user hasn't selected an artist yet. So anytime our form is empty, the delete button shouldn't be visible. The delete button only is visible when the ID property has a value. So with that change, now our page loads. Okay, so we don't see the delete button because when the page loads, the name and ID properties, those are empty. As soon as we click, delete becomes visible. Clear? We're setting ID back to undefined, so the delete button disappears. So this behavior is as it should be. Artist to delete. So I'm going to add an artist. Shows up here. And now when I select it, if I click delete, I can cancel. It stays here. I can clear my form. Delete goes away. Now if I click delete and click OK, it's gone from my list. My form clears. And the delete button also hides. Again. Okay, so our delete with our series of 3 methods is working along with our click handler, but we need to make sure we hide that button if there is no artist that's been selected. Okay, anybody have any questions or need to see any of the methods in order to get your delete working? So again, 1 method in our server backend, 2 methods in our Angular app. 1 in the service, 1 in the component. So our workflow is button click calls the component, component calls the service, service calls the server API. Server API talks to the database and performs our CRUD operation there. Going to make one other little change here. We start to think about our edit. Right now we have a button that says save for adding a new artist. We're going to want to put another button here instead when we go to update. So this button calls add artist. We're going to want another button that calls update artist. So maybe I'll change this to say add. And then we're going to show or hide. So we're going to change this button so it says add. I'm going to put another button on underneath. I'll leave the click handler for now. So we've got an add and we've got an update button. But these 2 buttons should never be visible at the same time. It's kind of like Clark Kent Superman. You can't see them both at once. So when we have no artist, when our form is clear, we want to show the add button. But as soon as we select an artist, we want to show the update and hide the add. So we can use ng if directives on each of these buttons. So there's always one visible, but never 0 and never 2. So on my add artist, we use ng if not underscore ID. So when the ID is undefined, when it has no value, our form is clear, show the add button. The update is going to be the opposite. We're going to use ng if without this exclamation mark. So when we've got an ID, an artist selected, update and delete are visible. When we have no ID, update and delete are invisible, add is visible instead. Okay, so these buttons, they'll never be visible at the same time. Because if one is visible, the other is the exact opposite. And so long as an artist is selected, we can see update and delete. As soon as we clear or load the page, we'll get add. So update and delete are only visible when our form is populated with an existing document. Okay, it is 10 to 12, so I think this is a good time for us to take a little break. I will upload the code we've done so far to GitHub, and we'll jump back into it and we'll deal with our update. We'll deal with that at 12. Okay, we'll come back in 10 minutes.